The effects of continued climate change could be irreversible, a UN panel warns in its latest report. But it says there is still time if we change the way we live rapidly. From rising seas to melting ice, the panel says the impact will be disastrous. Could this report be the last chance for policymakers? Indeed, for the rest of us. This is Inside Story. Well, welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Our dependence on fossil fuels has to end, according to scientists and government officials from more than 180 countries. It is possible, they say, to have most of the world's electricity produced from other sources by 2050, and all of it by the end of this century. The findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have been described as the most important on the subject in years. The report highlights the human impact on climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. It says in the last 3 decades, the Earth's surface temperatures have been the highest they've been in 800 years. It warns that extreme weather events such as hurricanes, heat waves and floods and the damage they bring with them will only get worse. Previous guesses about what's happening have been replaced by much more accurate predictions, according to the IPCC. That's thanks to massive advances in computer technology. And it emphasises the need to make use of what's called the carbon budget, the most accurate way of measuring how close we are to maximum levels of carbon emissions. Now, if the IPCC has no doubt about the reality of human-induced climate change, can we see examples of that change in our day-to-day weather? Richard Angwin is one of Al Jazeera's team of meteorologists monitoring global weather on a daily basis. So what changes has he seen in the world weather?
Well, that's a tricky one, David, because depending on where you are, the weather changes on a day-by-day, an hour-by-hour, even a minute-by-minute basis. Adding the effects of the seasons, El Nino, sunspot activity, longer-term atmospheric cycles, and you can see the difficulty in being able to detect the influence of human-induced climate change on our weather. And whether you're looking at flooding or at mudslides or at drought, very often population pressures play their part, whether that's from deforestation, urbanisation, or the growing demand for water for agriculture and industry. So that's a difficulty facing meteorologists and climatologists. But a recent report explaining extreme weather events of 2013 from a climate perspective looked to do just that. And it found that there was strong evidence to support the idea that the heat waves which hit Europe, which hit Japan, China, were made much worse by a warming world. Similarly, the UK's coldest spring in 50 years would have been a lot worse if it hadn't been for the effects of global warming. But as for things like the drought in California and the devastation wrought by Super Typhoon Haiyan, the most powerful ever recorded, the evidence is far from clear. But all the computer models point to what we have already observed, that extreme weather is becoming ever more likely in a warming world.
OK, let us bring in our guests now. In Copenhagen, Arthur Peterson from University College London. He's the IPCC delegate for the Dutch government. In London, we have Brian Kilkelly, Chief Exec of the World Cities Network. We'll find out more about that in a moment. And from Karachi, I'm joined by Khadija Zakhir, who studies climate change and environmental issues and who's been talking to those in Pakistan most affected. Very warm welcome to each one of you. Arthur Peterson, you've been at this conference. You're there on behalf of the Dutch government. Can you give our audience an idea? We've heard so many different statements about climate change over the years. What is new in this?
Well, what is new? We have had 3 working group reports already over the past few months. But what's new is that we have just a 100-page document now, which includes everything you would need to know if you were a policy maker, a negotiator on climate change. So things are brought together on mitigation, adaptation, and how they relate. And also, well, you have to do both, and that has been most clear from the evidence.
And this is not a situation where we have one of those climate change conferences where there's eventually a lot of disagreement and no final agreement. This is where the scientists come together and say, we really believe this is what's happening.
Well, we have a beautiful thing in the UN system of having a scientific body which is chaired also by scientists and which assess all the scientific literature every 7 years. So they have got together, and the beautiful thing also is it's intergovernmental, so all the 200 UN governments, they have signed off on this report. They have stated that this is a valid summary of the science, and this is at least one thing they can agree on, and then they have to think about measures.
In scientific terms, what would you say are the three most important points to come out of this?
Well, the reiteration, of course, that the warming is unequivocal and it's extremely likely that humans have been causing it. That is from the Working Group 1 report. I think it's very important now that you see together what are the risks that you will be taking if you would go to a 2 degrees world. There's discussions on whether a 1.5 degrees world may already be too much. So all the information you need to make this risk assessment and to make choices on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions are included in this single volume.
Thank you for now. Let's go to Brian Kilkelly in London. World cities. Give us an idea what it is. It seems to me as though it tries to give people and places a stake in trying to change the world.
That's right, David. Indeed it is. World Cities Network was set up a few years ago by myself and partners to really look at how we could move on from the discussions to actually take real action in cities. So it's a platform that brings together the city leaders, but also the architects, the engineers, property developers, investors, and actually technology companies to together work out how we can take action, how we can accelerate action, move forward faster.
And
so
Brian,
we've heard a lot of talk about climate change.
Do you think you've seen brought about because of the greater cooperation between the people and the cities themselves?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a recognition that we can't wait on governments and sort of, if you like, international groups to take action. You know, we really need to grab this by the horns now and take action at a local level. So many cities have seen severe disruption to their systems. We've got Hurricane Sandy in New York, for example. Even here in London, there's been a lot of stresses and strains on the infrastructure. So mayors and private sector leaders recognize this is something that really needs to start taking action now. And they're getting together to decide on the best way of doing that.
OK, I'm going to come back to you in a little while and ask you for the concrete example that's on your website about England and France and the differences there. So time to think about that one. It is about people. We're looking at pictures of the Brazilian city, Sao Paulo. They've got the worst drought there in 85 years. They're protesting. As many as 2 million people in the country's biggest city have been going without water for days at a time. Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina are all of those considered major producers of greenhouse gases. And overall, Latin America home to some of the most rapidly developing nations in the world. Tropical deforestation too, which is one of the big contributors to climate change. Let us go to Karachi now. I mentioned there Latin America, Khadija, but I mean, it is global, this problem. And you've been studying the effects in certain parts and with certain groups of people in Pakistan. What do you believe you've discovered?
Well, I think, David, I mean, I'd agree with what's being said before. Increasingly, when you go and talk to farmers, whether they're in southern Punjab or they're in interior Sindh, they tell you that the summer is getting increasingly hotter. It gets so hot for some of them that they feel that they just don't have the energy or the capacity to go out and work in the fields anymore, which is affecting their crop pattern. It's affecting productivity and yield. It's affecting the amount of food that they produce, which they then sell and also consume at a household level. Women, rural women in particular, will tell you that there is acute shortages of water, both groundwater as well as rainfall. So, I mean, we're seeing how all of this is having a very real impact on the way people live and how they see their futures turning out.
And are the people in authority there listening? And if they are listening, are they able to do anything to help these farmers, these fishermen?
Well, I think there seems to be a disconnect between what people's lived realities are and how policymakers envision the world. And I think that seems to be true in our case as well. So, for instance, when you talk to farmers or you talk to fishermen, they say what they need really more than anything else is information that is scientific and credible and that is backed by government authority. So they need to know new techniques of cropping. They need to know how to make water last longer and use it more efficiently. and they need to be able to contact sort of local officials who will be able to give them this information in a consistent and coherent fashion. Policymakers, on the other hand, tend to have sort of a much broader view of the situation. So the nitty-gritties or the mechanics of how this information is going to be communicated seems to be missing.
Professor Peterson, one of the points you made is that it's important for governments to have the scientific findings. Do you find that there are rich governments that know all about this already, and that there are others less well advantaged in scientific research who really do need to have it hammered home by people such as yourself?
I have a strong view on this, that indeed there is a huge disparity in the abilities of different governments to harness their scientific information. And the IPCC can only deliver some stuff on the global scale and cannot really go into the depth of what things imply for separate countries. So one of the things I have been, and our government, Dutch government, has been pleading for is the IPCC to work on methodologies also on how the different countries can use IPCC information to tailor that towards their own country-specific needs. So it's not up to the UN to do all these assessments for different countries, but it's very important for the international community to help all the countries that don't have the huge science base that the rich countries have.
And how could they go about doing that?
Base so that they can also be... Well, they can go about doing it by training, by investing in scientific collaboration, by having scientists from developing countries more participate in the IPCC. And that all starts with doing the scientific research itself. So data is so limited on many of the things related to climate change, not only the climate change, but also their impacts, that it's really very clear from some white spots on maps that lots of work needs to be done in the developing countries.
Brian Kilkelly, as a young man, I read you went off to South America and you saw the poverty in which some people lived. You decided that, yes, that had to change, but there had to be perhaps a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the point about the IPCC report and the need to make that applicable to people in their real day jobs, whether you're a city leader or a private sector leader, is a really important point. So we've been supporting, for example, the work by the European Climate Foundation and the University of Cambridge in translating the IPCC findings into specific sectors. So they've produced a summary for cities, for business leaders, and for people involved in investment. And this is really helpful because it's put...
If you can, give us an idea, a practical example about how the greater cooperation that you talk about, that you espouse, has made a difference in one of the world's largest cities, for example.
Yeah, and I'll come back to the Paris point, which is a good one to follow on. So cities are increasingly reaching out to each other to learn the various policies and the various methods that are working. So actually, even here in London, for example, we implemented the bicycle sharing scheme after Paris implemented it. Looked across at Paris, saw what they were doing, and decided to implement the same thing here. We're also now bringing in electric cars from a French company that has been very successful again in Paris, implementing those. So cities recognize that they need to move fast, they need to act fast, but they don't necessarily have the resources or the time to do that. So they're building connections between each other through our network, through other networks, to make sure action can be accelerated.
What would you say to cities in the developing world? I'm sorry to keep batting in. What would you say to cities in the developing world? Because you're talking here about rich cities.
Yes, the developing world is particularly challenging, especially as the World Bank, for example, pointed out recently, only 4% of the largest 500 developing cities in the world have a credit-worthy status. So a lack of access to credit for developing countries to be able to invest in their infrastructure is a major barrier. So I think one of the opportunities, if you like, for developing countries is to find their own way to finance infrastructure from a bottom-up approach, rather than relying completely on large funding from international organisations to build big infrastructure projects.
Yeah, okay, well, let's go to Khadija here, because you're talking about building from the bottom up here. Are you seeing ways in which you referred to the farmers in particular in Pakistan, are you seeing ways in which they are able to help themselves without perhaps understanding that this is for the good of the world, but it's just for the good of their own community?
Well, I think it really depends on the farmer. I mean, from what I've seen, it depends on how the community sees itself. If the community feels that it has sufficient resources, whether that means financial resources or it means a sense of social connectedness, if they feel that they have both of those, and they're more willing to take a risk. And by risk, I mean that they are then willing to change the way they do business, the way they change the way they grow their crops or they harvest their fields. But if they feel that they don't have any resources, if they feel that this is the only thing that they know how to do, these are the only resources that they have, and that if they lose this, then they will essentially lose everything, then there is a huge sort of attitudinal barrier in making it.
You see, part of the problem, as I see it from what you're saying, is that governments don't necessarily target the right people in the right communities. Arthur Peterson, let me ask you about this one. Does it need to be more focused on specific communities rather than just on the big picture, which can be a little nefarious to many people?
Oh, absolutely. And this is, so I said that the IPCC cannot cater itself to all these different governments and other communities. However, in the IPCC report, more attention has been paid than ever to all these different levels, to cities, to different communities, and their importance in adapting to climate change and helping in mitigating climate change. So yes, I really think that we shouldn't just focus on this global UN, United Nations framework on climate change. It's still important, but more action is going on at other levels.
As a scientist and as a member of the human race, are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, but that's by nature. I do see lots of possibilities. If we work together, for instance, what would it cost to mitigate climate change? And it turns out to be 0.06 percentage points compared to a 1.6% to 3% annual growth rate. So it's a choice we can make to work together to do this on the cheap. It may be more expensive if we do it all apart.
Let me go back to you, Brian, because you talk to an awful lot of people who are being asked to change, who want to change. But when it comes to this statement by this IPCC group that we can be off our dependence on fossil fuels by the end of this century, and that most of our electricity could be produced in other ways within the next 36 years. Do you find them giving lip service to something like this? Do they really believe it's possible, or for want of a better phrase, is it a lot of hot air, what you hear?
Yeah, no, it is of course possible, and I think people feel that it has to be said. These things have to be stated. These targets need to be set out, and we need to aspire to these targets. But I know that the people involved in these preparations and these discussions recognise that it's going to be a big challenge to change the way we do things. And there are some amazing statistics around in terms of the risk to investment, the fact that we continue to burn fossil fuels. And many of our investments, many of our pensions indeed, are tied up in the companies that have these fossil fuels. And the reality is we can't burn this amount of fossil fuel. So actually the valuations of these organisations are actually probably false. So the climate bubble is a well-known sort of phenomena, if you like, that's being talked about more and more. And people are urging their investments, the people that hold their investments, to move that money out of fossil fuels into renewables, into other areas, because people recognise that we are going to need to move away from fossil fuels. But it's difficult, because
I do apologise once again. Khadija, one of the problems here is that because farmers, fishermen, other small business people in Pakistan are finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet, many of them, and particularly their children, are moving to the cities and adding to the problems.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, for farmers and fishers in particular, this is true. They find it unsustainable to keep their traditional livelihoods going. So increasingly, you have people moving to the city, which causes huge amounts of stress on already overburdened infrastructure that requires a lot of upkeep and a lot of maintenance to begin with. And the other aspect of the problem is that you see an increasingly elderly rural population, which doesn't have sort of social support or any social network or sort of financial stability in their life. So there's sort of a dual problem, both with migration into cities and then the exodus of young people from rural areas to urban areas.
Arthur Peterson, relatively young man, but you've been involved in this for some time. You are a professor, you advise governments. Have you seen a sea change, again, for want of a better description, a very different approach taken in the last 20, 25 years by people about this?
Well, I'm focusing my work mostly on the science for climate change, and I do see a huge increase of involvement of developing countries, and that should continue and is continuing. So that also means that, well, European countries and the Western countries will have to learn to adapt to a changing world where their role is getting smaller, and hopefully the science base is also really globalizing. So this is, I think, a hopeful sign that all the changes that we will be facing and that, let's say, the transformation in societies that need to be coming, that the ideas are not just coming from Europe, but they're coming from elsewhere too. So that's a sea change that I see. I also see that the natural science base is, of course, getting stronger and stronger, and now social sciences are broadening. So first it was just the economists, now it's more social scientists and even philosophers getting into the picture of how to deal with the scientific information.
What about the climate change deniers? Fewer and fewer in number?
Decision-making. They are fewer in tone, they are also fewer in number. So the big uncertainties are about the future and not about the past. So people should focus on whether it will rain more or less, because in some regions we don't know that. So you have to make decisions in a robust way for all those different scenarios. And that is why the focus now on the individual countries and what is coming to them becomes so much more important than focusing on whether or not humans are causing the climate change, because that debate is well over.
Brian Kilkelly, let's go back to the example I wanted you to bring up, which was that the French turn off all their lights at night in their cities and the Brits don't at the moment. It's little things like that on a local level that if other people see it elsewhere, they might think, hang on, that's worth doing.
I agree, and I think that's a great sort of method to follow in terms of sort of learning from other cities, learning from other countries, repeating the kind of good practices that are being developed. So we look, for example, to Copenhagen as a fantastic poster child of a city and that's going to be carbon neutral by 2020. So they're making great steps towards reducing their energy use, to increasing the amount of renewables into their network, and they really are going to probably make this target. So it shows that you can actually create a city, a vibrant, successful city that is carbon neutral. So it is, producing no carbon in its net operations.
Far be it from me to put you in the position of being
37%.
a science expert on this one, but you talk to a lot of people. What would you advise the good people of Karachi to do if you were to have a meeting with them tomorrow to take up any kind of initiative?
Yeah, I think the challenge for governments and for the city leaders in places like Karachi is how do they empower community groups, local organisations, the business community to be part of the solution. And this requires a sea change in the way that we govern our cities and our countries. We need to move decision-making down to a lower level. We need to see governments need to see themselves as enablers of action, not necessarily the actual doers of action. Because this is very urgent. We need to move faster. And actually, the best solutions tend to come from the bottom up. People know what they need to do in their neighbourhoods.
He says he's got an idea. I saw you nodding in agreement there. Is that happening at all in Karachi?
I think it is, but again, as you said, there needs to be a sea change, and the impetus forward is very, very slow, and almost in its embryonic stages. So we need to do much more and do it much faster.
And in terms of what you've seen since you began your research, would you say that there's been any improvement at all, or are we still seeing a massive decline in the circumstances of these people and of your country as a whole?
I wouldn't say that we haven't seen any changes. I would say that, communities that are empowered, communities where local organizations or NGOs are working, or where local government departments are active and are engaged and are committed with communities, we are seeing a change there. We are seeing people changing their livelihoods. We are seeing them better able to adapt to changing climate conditions. We are seeing some improvement in their life. But you see, when you look at it as a whole, these pockets of change get lost in everything else that's not happening. So what needs to happen is that all of these initiatives need to be upscaled or need to be connected to each other in a way that they become much more visible. And as you increase visibility, people become more aware. As people become more aware, it gives them confidence and courage that change is possible and that it is in your hands, and it doesn't have to be a tremendous step, and it doesn't have to be an extortionately expensive one either.
Indeed, and thank you to each one of my guests. That's Arthur Peterson, Brian Kilkelly and Khadija Zahir. And do please add your thoughts to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We are also on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. You can find us there. I'm David Foster. Thank you for watching. From me and the rest of the team, goodbye for now. See you next time.